An ordinary day at a bustling spring festival takes an unexpected turn when a man wearing a MAGA hat faces hostility, only to reveal an identity that leaves everyone speechless. This emotional story of judgment, forgiveness, and unity will leave you questioning your own assumptions. Stay until the end to see how one moment can change everything. It was a sunny afternoon in the heart of the city, where people gathered in the lively square for the annual spring festival. Booths lined the cobblestone streets, filled with colorful displays of food, crafts, and live music. Families strolled hand in hand. Children laughed as they chased balloons, and vendors enthusiastically called out to passers-by to try their wares. The atmosphere was joyous and full of life. Amid the sea of people, an older man quietly made his way through the crowd. His calm demeanor contrasted with the buzz around him. Dressed in a simple blazer, jeans, and polished shoes, he carried himself with an understated confidence. Yet, it wasn't his presence that caught people's attention. It was the bright red MAGA hat perched on his head. At first, the man blended in with the crowd, unnoticed by most. He stopped by a food stall, ordering a hot dog and taking his time to enjoy the simple pleasure. But as he turned to walk toward the fountain in the square, murmurs began to spread. A few onlookers nudged each other, pointing toward the man's hat. Some whispered quietly, their expressions betraying a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Among the murmurs, a group of 3 younger individuals, standing near a coffee cart, took notice. They exchanged smirks and rolled their eyes. "Can you believe this guy?" One of them, a tall man with a black hoodie, said loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Wearing that hat in a place like this? He's just asking for attention." A woman in the group, her arms crossed, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, seriously, what kind of message is he trying to send? It's disrespectful." As the man approached the fountain, he found a bench and sat down, taking in the lively scene. He seemed unfazed by the glances directed his way. His attention focused on the children playing nearby. But the group by the coffee cart had decided to make their presence known. The tall man approached the older gentleman, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Nice hat," he said, folding his arms and smirking. "Real bold choice wearing that around here." The man looked up, meeting his gaze calmly. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady. He then returned his attention to the square, seemingly uninterested in escalating the conversation. The response only fueled the group's determination. The others joined in, standing around the man in a loose circle. Their voices grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby festival goers. "What are you trying to prove?" one of them asked. "You think you're better than everyone else, wearing that? People like you are the reason we're so divided," the woman added, her voice tinged with anger. As the confrontation unfolded, more people began to take notice. A small crowd started to gather, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Others watched uncomfortably, unsure of whether to intervene or walk away. The festival's festive atmosphere was replaced by a palpable tension. The man remained seated, his posture relaxed despite the group's hostility. He calmly finished his hot dog and placed the wrapper in a nearby trash can. His silence seemed to aggravate the group even further. "You don't have anything to say?" the tall man demanded. "You're just gonna sit there and pretend like you're better than us?" The older man finally looked up, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not here to argue," he said. "I'm just enjoying the festival, same as you." The crowd murmured as the group's frustration boiled over. One of them, a younger man in a graphic t-shirt, stepped forward and knocked the hat off the older man's head. It fell to the ground, and the group erupted in laughter. "Let's see how tough you are without your little hat," the tall man sneered. The older man bent down slowly, picking up the hat and dusting it off. He placed it back on his head with care, his movements deliberate. His calm demeanor remained unshaken. But the crowd could see the weight of the moment in his eyes. A young child nearby, holding their mother's hand, pointed at the scene and asked, "Mommy, why are they being so mean to that man?" The question hung in the air, cutting through the noise and causing some onlookers to shift uncomfortably. The mother hushed the child, her expression uneasy. Not everyone in the crowd agreed with the group's actions. A middle-aged man with a camera around his neck stepped forward cautiously. "Hey, leave him alone," he said, his voice firm. "He's not bothering anyone." A young woman holding a festival program added, "Yeah, this is supposed to be a community event. Let's not ruin it." The group turned their attention to the new voices. "Stay out of this," the tall man snapped. "We're just calling out what needs to be called out." But the tide was beginning to turn. More voices from the crowd began to murmur their disapproval of the group's behavior. The older man, still seated, remained quiet, watching the scene unfold with a measured gaze. As the situation escalated, a police officer who had been patrolling the festival approached the scene. His presence immediately commanded attention, and the crowd parted slightly to let him through. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his tone calm but authoritative. The group quickly began to explain, each voice overlapping the other. "He's wearing that hat. He's trying to provoke people. It's offensive." The officer held up a hand, silencing them. He turned to the older man. "Sir, is everything okay here?" The man nodded. "I'm fine, officer. Just enjoying the festival." The officer glanced at the group, then back at the man. "Would you like me to escort you somewhere else?" The older man smiled faintly. "No need. I think I'll stay right here." As the officer prepared to move on, the older man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather case. He opened it and handed it to the officer. The crowd craned their necks, trying to see what it was. The officer's eyes widened slightly as he examined the ID. His demeanor shifted instantly, becoming more formal. "I see," he said, handing the ID back with a nod of respect. "Thank you, sir." The group and the crowd watched in confusion as the officer straightened his posture and addressed the man with a quiet but deferential tone. The man nodded in acknowledgement, placing the ID back in his pocket. The officer turned to the group, his expression stern. "You've made your point," he said firmly. "It's time to move along." As the older man walked away from the fountain, his calm demeanor only seemed to agitate the group further. They exchanged glances, their frustration simmering, as if his lack of reaction was an affront to their hostility. The tall man clenched his fists, muttering under his breath, "Who does he think he is? Acting like he's better than us?" The crowd that had gathered around began to follow at a distance. Their curiosity piqued. Some murmured to one another, speculating about the man's identity, while others quietly recorded the scene with their phones. The festive atmosphere of the square was now overshadowed by a tense undercurrent. The older man paused at a booth selling hand-carved wooden toys, inspecting a small figurine with genuine interest. He exchanged a few kind words with the vendor, a gray-haired woman with a warm smile, before purchasing the item. The group stood nearby, watching him with narrowed eyes. Unable to let the moment go, the tall man approached the older gentleman again, this time with more force in his tone. "You think you're just gonna walk around here like that? You're not welcome here with that hat." The man turned slowly to face him, his expression calm and measured. "I didn't realize this square belonged to anyone," he said, his voice steady. "I thought it was a public space where everyone could enjoy the festival." The tall man's face reddened. "Don't play dumb," he snapped. "That hat, what it stands for, you're making a statement whether you like it or not." The older man tilted his head slightly, considering the words. "And you've decided what that statement is, have you?" he asked, his tone neither accusatory nor defensive. "I wonder if you've asked yourself why you feel the need to assume." By now, the crowd had thickened, the murmurs growing louder as more people took notice of the escalating confrontation. A young woman holding a toddler whispered to her friend, "What's going on? Why are they targeting that man?" Her friend shrugged, watching the scene unfold. "It's the hat," she said. "People get so worked up over things like that." The group's leader, emboldened by the crowd, stepped closer to the older man. "You know exactly what you're doing," he said, jabbing a finger toward the man's chest. "Walking around here like you own the place, trying to stir people up." The older man didn't flinch. He simply met the tall man's gaze with a quiet intensity. "I'm not trying to stir anyone up," he said, "but it seems I've stirred something in you. Maybe it's worth asking yourself why." At the edge of the crowd, a middle-aged woman with a camera slung around her neck stepped forward. She had been observing the scene with growing concern and finally decided to intervene. "Hey," she said firmly, addressing the group, "leave him alone. He hasn't done anything wrong." The tall man turned to her, his expression a mix of irritation and disbelief. "You're defending him?" he asked. "Do you even know what that hat represents?" The woman crossed her arms. "I know what it represents to you," she said, "but maybe you should ask what it represents to him before you jump to conclusions." The group hesitated, their confidence wavering under her scrutiny. The crowd began to shift uneasily. some nodding in agreement with the woman while others remained silent. Just as it seemed the tension might de-escalate, one of the younger members of the group, a man in his early 20s with a graphic t-shirt, stepped forward. He snatched the hat off the older man's head and threw it onto the ground. "There," he said with a smirk. "Now you can enjoy the festival without causing trouble." The act drew a collective gasp from the crowd. The older man bent down slowly, retrieving the hat and brushing off the dust. He placed it back on his head with deliberate care, his movements calm and unhurried. The young man laughed nervously, glancing at the tall man for approval. But the tall man's smirk had faded, replaced by a flicker of doubt as the gravity of the moment began to sink in. The commotion caught the attention of the same police officer who had intervened earlier. He approached the scene with a purposeful stride, his gaze sweeping over the crowd and landing on the group surrounding the older man. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The tall man spoke up quickly, his tone defensive. "We're just trying to enjoy the festival. And this guy," he gestured toward the older man, "he's walking around wearing that hat, trying to provoke people." The officer raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. He turned to the older man. "Sir, is this true? Are you trying to provoke anyone?" The man shook his head. "I'm just here to enjoy the festival," he said simply. "But it seems my choice of headwear has caused a bit of a stir." The officer nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the group. "And you thought the appropriate response was to surround him and take his property?" he asked, his tone sharpening. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the officer's words sinking in. The tall man looked down at his feet, his earlier bravado replaced by palpable discomfort. The officer turned back to the older man. "Do you want to file a report, sir?" he asked. "We can handle this formally if you'd like." The man considered the question for a moment before shaking his head. "No," he said. "I think the lesson they've learned is punishment enough." The officer nodded, his respect for the man evident in his expression. He turned to the group. "You're lucky he feels that way," he said. "But let this be a lesson to you. Your actions have consequences." As the officer prepared to move on, the older man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather case. He handed it to the officer, who opened it and examined its contents. His eyes widened slightly, and his demeanor shifted. "Understood, sir," the officer said, handing the case back with a nod. "Thank you for your patience." The crowd watched in silence, their curiosity piqued. What had the officer seen that caused him to address the man with such deference? The older man returned the case to his pocket and adjusted his hat. Without another word, he began to walk away, leaving the crowd to wonder who he was and what had just transpired. As the man disappeared into the festival, the crowd began to disperse, their murmurs filling the air. Some speculated about the man's identity, while others reflected on the group's behavior. The middle-aged woman with the camera shook her head, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know who he is," she said to no one in particular, "but he's someone worth listening to." The tall man stood silently, his shoulders slumped. The weight of the encounter had left him visibly shaken. For the first time, he seemed to question the assumptions that had driven his actions. The tension from the square had begun to dissipate. But the older man's presence lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. As the group stood awkwardly, unsure of what to do next, murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Did you see the officer's reaction?" one person asked. "Who is that guy?" The man in the red MAGA hat had left the immediate scene, but his quiet composure and mysterious interaction with the officer had left behind a trail of curiosity. People who had initially been focused on the hat and their assumptions about him were now asking themselves deeper questions. What had the officer seen in that leather case? Why had his demeanor changed so quickly? The officer who had intervened lingered for a moment, his gaze following the man as he walked toward the festival's main stage. He adjusted his radio and muttered a few words into it before turning back to the crowd. "Move along, folks," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "The festival is still in full swing." Meanwhile, the older man moved through the square with a steady gait. He paused briefly to glance at a display of books at a vendor's booth, picking one up and flipping through the pages. He nodded thoughtfully at the vendor and handed over some cash to purchase it before tucking the book under his arm. At this point, whispers began to spread further. A man in the crowd, who had been filming earlier, turned to his friend. "I'm telling you," he said. There's something about him. That cop looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Did you catch his badge when he pulled it out? The friend shook his head, but the intrigue was infectious. Maybe he's some kind of big-shot retired officer. Another person chimed in. The buzz grew louder and slowly. People began to follow the older man as he continued his journey through the festival grounds. The older man's path led him to the festival's main stage, where the mayor's address was scheduled to take place in just a few minutes. The area was bustling with activity as organizers rushed to adjust microphones. Local bands finished their sets, and attendees gathered to find seats. Unbeknownst to the crowd still following him, the man with the red hat quietly approached the side of the stage, where several city officials were gathered. They greeted him warmly, shaking his hand and exchanging a few hushed words. One of the festival volunteers, a teenage boy wearing a bright yellow staff vest, approached a city official. "Excuse me," he said, glancing toward the older man. "Is that the mayor's dad or something?" The official chuckled and shook his head. "No, son," he said, lowering his voice. "That is the mayor." As the older man climbed the steps to the stage, the crowd around the square began to take notice. Those who had followed him from the fountain exchanged wide-eyed glances, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. "It can't be," one of the group members whispered. The mayor, no way. The tall man, who had been leading the harassment earlier, stood frozen in place. His face turned pale as he stared at the stage, his mind racing to reconcile the events that had just transpired. The group of bystanders who had stood up for the older man looked at each other, their earlier words of support now carrying even greater weight. The mayor, now standing at the podium, adjusted the microphone and removed his hat, placing it on the stand in front of him. The crowd fell silent as his voice carried across the square. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his tone warm and steady. "Thank you all for coming out to celebrate our annual spring festival. This event is a reminder of what makes our city so special, our shared community, our diversity, and our commitment to working together." He paused, scanning the crowd with a gaze that seemed to meet every eye. "But before I talk about the future of our city, I want to address something that happened today, something that I believe reflects a challenge we must face together." The crowd shifted uneasily, the weight of his words settling over them like a blanket. The tall man lowered his head, avoiding the mayor's gaze. The mayor picked up his hat and held it up for everyone to see. "Some of you may have noticed this hat," he said, "and some of you may have made assumptions about who I am because of it." He looked out over the crowd, his expression kind but firm. "This hat has become a symbol, a controversial one, to be sure. But today, I didn't wear it to make a political statement. I wore it to see how people would treat someone based on appearances alone." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a mix of guilt and admiration spreading through the square. The mayor continued, his voice unwavering. "What I experienced today was eye-opening," he said. "It reminded me that our assumptions about others can blind us to who they really are. And it showed me that we still have work to do to create a community where everyone feels seen, respected, and valued not just for what they wear or what they believe, but for who they are as human beings." The crowd's energy shifted from tension to reflection. People who had stood by silently during the earlier confrontation now found themselves questioning their actions or lack thereof. The tall man glanced nervously at his friends, who avoided his gaze. One of the bystanders who had stepped in to defend the mayor earlier felt a swell of pride. "I knew there was something about him," she whispered to her friend. "You could just tell." The mayor placed the hat back on the podium and leaned forward slightly. "We talk a lot about unity in our city," he said. "But unity doesn't mean we all have to agree. It means we have to learn to listen, to ask questions before we judge, to see each other as people, not labels." As the mayor wrapped up his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. Some clapped enthusiastically, while others clapped quietly, their expressions thoughtful. The tall man, who had been at the center of the earlier harassment, hesitated before making his way toward the stage. When the mayor stepped down, the tall man approached him, his head bowed. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know who you were." The mayor looked at him for a long moment, then smiled gently. "It's not about who I am," he said. "It's about who we all are. Let's do better together." The mayor stepped off the stage, the applause still echoing across the square. For a moment, he paused, looking out at the crowd. The sea of faces showed a mix of admiration, guilt, and reflection. Some clapped louder than others. Some stood silently, deep in thought. And some, like the group that had confronted him, seemed frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The tall man, still reeling from his earlier behavior, hesitated before slowly stepping forward. His face was pale, his movements cautious, and his earlier bravado now replaced with visible regret. He watched as the mayor moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging warm words with festival goers who approached him. In this moment, the tall man realized the depth of his mistake. This wasn't just a man in a MAGA hat. This was someone who had devoted his life to the city, someone who represented integrity and understanding. His heart sank as he replayed his words and actions in his mind. The tall man finally gathered the courage to approach the mayor. He took a deep breath, clutching the edge of his jacket as he walked toward him. His friends hung back, watching nervously but saying nothing. When the mayor noticed him, he turned, his expression calm and welcoming. "Hello," the mayor said, his voice warm but steady. "What can I do for you?" The tall man hesitated, looking down at the ground. I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low. "For earlier, I didn't know who you were." The mayor tilted his head slightly, his gaze kind but curious. "And if you had known, would it have changed how you treated me?" he asked gently. The question caught the man off guard. He opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, unsure of what to say. After a moment, he shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I shouldn't have acted the way I did. It wasn't right." The mayor nodded slowly. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is that we learn from them." The exchange between the two men caught the attention of those nearby. Slowly, a small crowd began to form around them, watching intently as the tall man struggled to find the right words. "I thought I was standing up for something," the man continued, his voice trembling slightly. "But I realize now that I wasn't listening. I didn't give you a chance to speak for yourself. I just assumed." The mayor placed a hand on the man's shoulder, his touch firm yet reassuring. "Assumptions can be dangerous," he said. "They can blind us to the truth and lead us to act in ways we regret. But recognizing that is the first step toward change." The tall man nodded, his eyes brimming with emotion. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being patient, for not fighting back." The mayor smiled gently. "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words," he said. "And sometimes it's the only way to break through the noise." The conversation between the mayor and the tall man seemed to have a ripple effect on the crowd. People who had been bystanders during the earlier confrontation began to reflect on their own actions or inactions. A young woman who had recorded the incident on her phone stepped forward, her cheeks flushed with guilt. "I didn't do anything to stop it," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I just stood there and watched. I should have said something." The mayor turned to her, his expression understanding. "It's never too late to stand up for what's right," he said. "What matters is that you recognize the power of your voice and use it moving forward." Others in the crowd nodded in agreement, their faces a mix of shame and determination. The festival, which had once been a scene of division and tension, was now becoming a space for connection and growth. The mayor stepped onto a nearby bench, addressing the growing crowd. "Today was a reminder," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "A reminder that we all have the capacity to judge, to assume, to act out of fear or anger. But it was also a reminder that we have the capacity to change." He looked out over the crowd, his gaze steady and compassionate. "We live in a world where symbols can divide us," he continued. "Where a hat, a sign, or a word can spark conflict. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can choose to listen. We can choose to ask questions. We can choose to see each other as people, not as labels." The crowd listened in silence, their attention fixed on the mayor. His words resonated deeply, touching on themes that went far beyond the events of the day. "We talk about unity," he said, "but unity doesn't mean we all have to agree. It means we have to respect each other's differences and find common ground. It means we have to be willing to learn from one another." As the mayor stepped down from the bench, he turned back to the tall man. "I forgive you," he said simply. "Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Forgiveness is what allows us to move forward." The tall man's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do better. I promise." The mayor smiled. "That's all I ask," he said. The moment was a powerful one, not just for the tall man, but for everyone who witnessed it. It was a reminder of the strength that comes from humility, compassion, and the willingness to grow. As the festival continued, the atmosphere began to shift. Conversations that had once been filled with tension and judgment were now marked by reflection and understanding. People who had been strangers just hours earlier were now engaging in meaningful dialogue, sharing their perspectives and learning from one another. The mayor, meanwhile, continued to move through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging words with festival goers. His quiet leadership had turned a moment of division into an opportunity for growth, leaving a lasting impact on everyone he encountered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the square in hues of orange and gold, the spring festival was winding down. Booths began to pack up, families ushered their children home, and the lively music softened into a gentle melody in the background. But while the festival itself was ending, the conversations sparked by the mayor's presence and his speech were far from over. Groups of people lingered in the square, their faces marked by contemplation. Some still whispered about the events of the day, while others openly discussed their realizations. For many, the sight of the mayor walking calmly through the square in his red MAGA hat and enduring harassment without retaliation had left an indelible mark. The tall man who had been at the center of the earlier confrontation sat on a bench near the fountain, his head in his hands. His friends had left, too embarrassed to stay after everything that had happened. But he remained unable to shake the weight of his actions. Around him, festival goers passed by, some glancing at him but saying nothing. The mayor, who had spent much of the afternoon speaking with attendees and fostering new connections, noticed the tall man sitting alone. Without hesitation, he approached him, his footsteps soft against the cobblestones. "Mind if I join you?" the mayor asked, his tone kind. The tall man looked up, startled, and quickly wiped at his face. He hesitated before nodding, gesturing to the empty spot beside him. The mayor sat down, resting his elbows on his knees and gazing out at the square. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, the tall man broke the silence. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I acted like a fool today." The mayor turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "We all have moments we're not proud of," he said. "What matters is what we do afterward." The tall man nodded slowly. I didn't see you as a person," he said. "I saw the hat, and I thought I knew everything about you. But I was wrong." The mayor smiled faintly, nodding in understanding. "You're not the first person to judge me based on appearances," he said, "and you won't be the last. But I didn't wear this hat today to provoke anyone. I wore it because I wanted to see how people would react, to challenge the assumptions we all make, myself included." The tall man frowned, his brow furrowing. "But why that hat?" he asked. "You must know what it represents to people. Why choose something so controversial?" The mayor leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Because it's a symbol that divides us," he said. "And because I believe the only way to bridge that divide is to face it head on. We can't heal as a community if we're too afraid to talk about the things that separate us." The tall man was silent for a long moment, processing the mayor's words. "You're a better man than I am," he said finally, his voice quiet. "If someone treated me the way I treated you, I don't think I could forgive them." The mayor placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook," he said. "It's about freeing yourself from the weight of anger and resentment. It's not easy, but it's necessary." The tall man looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know if I deserve forgiveness," he admitted. "Not after the way I acted." "Deserving it isn't the point," the mayor replied. "What matters is what you do with it. Will you let this moment define you, or will you use it to grow?" The tall man met the mayor's gaze, his eyes filled with determination. "I want to do better," he said. "Not just for myself, but for the people around me, for my kids. I don't want them to grow up thinking it's okay to judge people the way I did." The mayor smiled, his expression warm. "That's a good start," he said. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with a single step." The tall man nodded, a small smile breaking through his guilt. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." The mayor stood, extending a hand to help the man up. "We're all in this together," he said. "Let's make it count." As the mayor and the tall man parted ways, the festival square was abuzz with conversations sparked by the day's events. People who had never met before were now talking openly, sharing their perspectives and reflecting on their own biases. A young woman who had filmed the earlier confrontation approached the mayor, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I wanted to apologize," she said. "I recorded what happened, but I didn't step in when I should have. I was too afraid." The mayor nodded, his expression kind. "Fear is natural," he said, "but courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to act despite it. You have a voice, and it's powerful. Use it." The woman nodded, her resolve strengthening. "I will," she said. "Thank you." As the festival came to an end, the mayor gathered with the city's officials and volunteers to close out the event. Standing on the stage one last time, he addressed the crowd with a sense of hope. "Today wasn't just a celebration of our city," he said. "It was a reminder of who we are and who we can be. We are a community that values respect, understanding, and growth. Let's carry that spirit with us, not just today, but every day." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the square. The mayor stepped down, greeted by handshakes, hugs, and words of gratitude from those he had inspired. As the mayor walked away from the square, his red MAGA hat perched proudly on his head, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The events of the day had been challenging, but they had also been transformative. He knew that the conversations, sparked by his presence, would continue long after the festival ended. For the tall man, the day marked a turning point. He left the square with a renewed sense of purpose, vowing to become a better person and to teach his children the importance of empathy and understanding.